Good morning. Happy Canada Day. So today we start our introduction to the topic of apologetics, Christian apologetics. So here we go, sermon number 1. I texted an old friend a few weeks ago to see how she was doing, as it had been such a long time since we were in touch. She asked me what I was up to, and I mentioned I was working on a sermon for the church. She responded, "Yes, I'd love to come to your church and hear your sermon sometime, but you know how I feel about religion. I just can't accept that something that happened so long ago in another culture has any bearing on my life. God and I, we just don't get along. I'm not even sure he really exists." I'm sure we all have friends, family, co-workers who are not interested in Christianity or who have turned from their religious roots for one reason or another. Perhaps you were that person. Perhaps you still have doubts or questions. Fair enough. There are many questions to ask, and the church hasn't really done a great job offering solid answers to many questions over the years. The church I grew up in offered me phrases like, "You just have to believe. I know science says this, but the Bible disagrees and you have to stand by the Word of God." Or my personal favorite, "Well, Sasha, you just don't question God." This morning, I am going to introduce you to the world of Christian apologetics, a world many of us feel uncomfortable hanging out in. And this is mainly because we struggle to find good answers to many of the questions rolling around in our own heads. So how can we possibly expect to have anything intelligent to offer a world that asks tough questions about our faith? As my husband is an apologetics enthusiast, we just happen to have a number of great resources to recommend. Some of them I have on the screen here. I think it should be. Good. Here we go. So there's some of them on the floor in our office. I laid them all out so you can see.
It's not all of them.
It's not all of them. Some of them I will quote today, and all of them will be posted on the web in a reading list for you if you're interested in learning more about apologetics on your own. So the reading list is the next slide. One more. There we go. There's quite a few, actually. You won't be able to see them from there, but we'll post this on the web for you. Apologetics is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as systematic argumentative discourse. It's in defense of something, a branch of theology devoted to the defense of the divine origin and authority of Christianity. Now, Wikipedia says, coming from the Greek, it means speaking in defense. It is the religious discipline of defending religious doctrines through systematic argumentation and discourse. So we learned that in exploring. Wikipedia goes on to say that early Christian writers in the 1st and 2nd century who defended their beliefs against critics and recommended their faith to outsiders were called Christian apologists. The Apostle Paul was one such Christian apologist. And there's a famous passage in Acts 17, verses 16 through 34, that records how when he went to Athens, he stood up on the Areopagus and gave his apologia. The Areopagus was a high cropping of rocks that overlooked Athens. There you can see it. And it literally means the rock of Ares, and Ares was the Greek god of war. Perhaps you'll remember that. So this big platform of rocks provided a good place for people to gather together. Meetings were held, and especially by the city council and the school of philosophers. So the Greek text says, Paul stood up and gave his apologia. He had been wandering around the city, preaching the gospel, and some Greeks nabbed him and brought him up to the city council and the school of Greek philosophers to explain his preaching. And this is when he remarks on the altar to an unknown God. So it is from this text we derive the word apologetics. Perhaps you can recall some of the messages you've heard in this church where Paul or one of the other New Testament writers defends the faith or defends the identity and truth of who Jesus is and what he did, or defends the faith against a specific heresy such as Gnosticism or Donatism. Sure, there have been a lot of them. It seems to me the gospel writers spent most of their time writing to remind the church of what they believed and to sort out various issues the churches got caught up in one heresy or another. We all need constant reminding of the foundation of our faith. Now perhaps you're saying, well, Sasha, this is all very interesting, but I already believe in God. I come to church, so why do I need to worry about the issues raised by atheists or agnostics, or even those of other religions? Shouldn't we just leave that all to the theologians and evangelists to debate these topics and be the great defenders of the Christian faith? Well, maybe. For some of us that might be enough. I spent a lot of my life just following along, not asking questions. I still believed in God, of course. Isn't that good enough? Perhaps. But a better route could be to ponder some tough questions and find answers. Consider how much we will learn about ourselves and our faith. I would like to offer this morning 3 reasons why we should study Christian apologetics. Here they are. Number 1, to strengthen our faith. Number 2, to understand what the world believes about Christianity. We don't want to live in a bubble, do we? And number 3, to be able to give an answer when asked. So let's look at these reasons together. Number 1, to strengthen our faith. In my undergrad, I studied English literature. So I read a lot of books at university. Part of my studies included reading Old English texts like The Dream of the Rood and Beowulf, written in the 8th and 11th centuries, and Middle English texts such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 14th century. You guys read those all the time, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. I loved looking at the original text and translating the Old English into modern English so I could understand the meaning. Seeing the original text brought a sense of reality to the words on the page, a reality that often didn't resonate with me when it came to reading the Bible. However, when I started into seminary, I was exposed to original source material as it related to the Bible, and the Bible started to become more alive for me and more believable. The stories no longer felt like they were set in a vacuum, apart from the reality of history going on around them. For me, the Old Testament used to feel like it was written in isolation of history. This solitary tribe of people, the Israelites, wandering around in the desert all by themselves, apart from other nations. It suddenly became real to me when I saw it set within the context of the many nations living in the Middle East at the time, all influenced by and influencing the other cultures around them. Understanding the creation story as a myth to teach a truth about God and viewing the source material that predated the creation story helped me to reconcile science and what I read in the Bible. Suddenly my faith was making practical sense. And as I started to learn more, I discovered that there is much archaeology and extra biblical material to corroborate the stories of Jesus and the apostles. Extra biblical meaning, sources that are outside of the Jewish Christian world. Texts such as histories, poetry, and music from other nations. The writings of historians such as Josephus verify the existence and details of the early church. And influences found in our biblical texts are also seen in the Hellenistic cultures around them, such as Stoic philosophy and Gnostics influences, and references to diasporic Judaism. You remember the diaspora? It is the dispersion of Jews among the Gentiles after the Babylonian exile in 591 BC. And all of these different resources and learnings helped to strengthen my faith. Check out this cool chart I found. You probably can't see it. Check it out. I found online, and it lists the different ancient texts that we currently have copies of. All of the ancient texts, there are way more of the New Testament than any other. And the date between when the text was originally written and the first copies were written are closer by hundreds of years with the New Testament copies than any other ancient text. This is serious proof of the authenticity of these texts. I'll also post this, the link and this chart on the web after the sermon. Some of the niggling questions that I was told to ignore or to forget were being answered, and my faith was strengthened. I had not believed in vain. Believing in God and Jesus and what the Bible teaches began to make logical sense. My faith didn't have to be blind, nor did it have to be just about an experience that made me feel good and helped me along in life. Certainly, this is true of belief in Jesus, but it doesn't mean that there are not solid and concrete foundations for our belief. Number 2, to understand what the world believes about Christianity. I came across this cute little book titled Unanswered by Jeremiah Johnson. And in the book, he writes this: tough questions are being asked about Christianity inside and outside of the church. Questions are great, but only if you know the answers. Many in today's church do not know the Bible as well as they should, and people outside the church hardly know it at all. Consequently, Christians are ill-equipped to provide the answers our culture and communities desperately need. Christians struggle with their own big questions about faith and don't know where to turn for answers. Perhaps some of you feel this way. You have questions about the Bible or your faith rolling around in your head, and you've never found a satisfying answer for them. You hope no one asks you about your thoughts on a variety of theological topics because, well, let's face it, you haven't formed an opinion on them, or perhaps you're not sure exactly why you believe as you do. You just do. However, if you had to defend your opinion, you would be sunk. Sure, me too. I don't have it all sorted out. He doesn't have it all sorted out. Lots of us don't have it all sorted out. Couldn't resist. When Chad and I first met and married, we moved to Japan for a few years. I taught English, and Chad was a wedding celebrant, and we started a church. The church was bilingual, and we had a mix of Westerners. There were Japanese people, Koreans, Chinese, and Indians in our church, just to mention a few. And on more than one occasion, someone would ask me a question about the Bible or God that I didn't know the answer to. And after a while, it struck me that I had grown up in the church, considered myself a Christian since childhood, and yet I had never stopped to ask the questions about the Bible or God that these baby Christians or seekers were asking me. I don't even remember what the questions were, but I do remember feeling appalled that I hadn't even bothered to ask these questions. My journey eventually took me back to seminary, where I found many opportunities to ask tough questions, and furthermore, to be in an environment where I could hear the questions that others were asking and learn from them too. Do we know what the world thinks of God, of Jesus, of Christianity? Do we ever ask? I'm sure you've heard comments, and perhaps you thought this at one point in your own life. Christianity is useless and irrelevant. Religion is for the weak. God is dead. Jesus was a man. He probably married Mary Magdalene and they had kids. The Bible and science don't mix. Christianity is just one of many religions that all lead to God, so believe what you want. How can you really believe the Bible when there are so many inconsistencies? And miracles? Really? Yeah, whatever. Here are some of the most popular reasons why people do not believe in God or follow Jesus, as laid out by journalist Lee Strobel in his book, The Case for Faith. How many of you have read The Case for Faith? A few of you have. Okay, it's an awesome book. It's an awesome introduction to apologetics. If you're going to start anywhere, I would say maybe start with that one because it gives a really great overview of apologetics. So here are a few of the reasons why people do not believe in God or follow Jesus as laid out in this book. Number one, if there is a loving God, why does this pain-racked world groan under so much suffering and evil? Good question. In The Case for Faith, Lee tells a story about a man named Charles Templeton. Charles was a contemporary of the evangelist Billy Graham. Charles and Billy met when they were in their early 30s and became fast friends and partners in evangelism for a few years. Through this time, Charles struggled with doubt about his faith, and finally one day, after seeing a photo of a woman in Life magazine, he renounced his faith. This was a big deal, since he was an evangelist and made his living preaching the gospel. The image in the magazine was of a black woman in North Africa. They were experiencing a devastating drought, and she was holding her dead baby and staring up into the sky with a forlorn expression on her face. Charles looked at the photograph and asked himself, is it possible to believe that there is a loving or caring creator when all this woman needed was rain? I mean, isn't God in charge of the rain? This is a field of apologetics called theodicies. Theodicy is an explanation for the existence of evil alongside the belief in an all-knowing, all-powerful, loving God. So there is evil in the world. We recognize that. God is all-knowing. He sees it. He's all-powerful. He can stop the evil. And he is loving. How do we reconcile all the evil in the world? The discipline of theodicy is too big to get into today, but there are many fantastic books written about theodicies, and the answers are never easy. One day, we'll take a deeper look into theodicies. Number two, if the miracles of God contradict science, then how can any rational person believe that they are true? I mean, the parting of the Red Sea, a virgin birth, raised from the dead. All of these things contradict nature. But does one have to suspend their critical judgment in order to believe in something as improbable as miracles? William Lane Craig, professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in California, would argue, and has written many books on this topic, that believing in miracles is ridiculous only if you do not believe that God exists. Believing in miracles is ridiculous only if you do not believe that God exists. So Norman Geisler, professor of apologetics at Dallas Theological Seminary, argues the issue of God's existence in his book Christian Apologetics. If there is no God, no creator of the universe, then all the other questions are irrelevant. First, one must settle the question of God. Apologetics must start with the question of God's existence. Now let's remember that apart from God as creator, science has yet to explain the nature of the universe and matter itself, which leads me to point number 3. Do science and the Bible contradict each other? Many people think it does, but there are even more that think it does not. Science and the Bible should never contradict each other because they have the same author. Science and the Bible should never contradict each other because they have the same author. If there is a contradiction, then we need to examine the science and we need to examine the hermeneutic. What is that, you ask? Well, as we learned in Exploring Bible Knowledge, hermeneutic is the branch of knowledge that deals with interpretation. Are we interpreting our Bibles correctly? The leading theory which reconciles science and the Bible is called intelligent design theory, which couples scientific discoveries of the nature of the universe with the proper approach to biblical hermeneutics, biblical interpretation. And when one approaches these issues from these angles, there are no contradictions. Exciting stuff, it really is. Chad is going to address this in more detail in some of his talks. But on to number 4. Number 4, it is offensive to claim that Jesus is the only way to God. Many accusations have been aimed at the Christian community, claiming it's arrogant of Christians to assert Jesus is the only way. But Ravi Zacharias, one of the world's most brilliant and articulate defenders of Christianity, argues that all religions, including atheism, claim exclusivity. Even the Eastern ones, like Hinduism, which seem open and accepting to other religions so long as you buy into their notion of truth. Christians are no more or less arrogant than others in the world. The nature of truth is that it is exclusive. If truth does not exclude, then there is no assertion of a truth claim being made. Anytime you make a truth claim, you mean that something contrary to it is false. For example, if I assert that there is a bear around the corner, you must ask yourself if there's a bear around the corner, so that you can investigate to see if it is true or not. Either there is a bear around the corner, or there is not. It can't be both. The Bible's claim of Jesus as the only way is either true or it is not true. This claim is especially important as our salvation rests on the truth of this claim. There are a number of great books that address the topic of Jesus as the only way in light of what other religions offer. Check out Ravi Zacharias' Jesus Among Other Gods. Number 5. If God cares about the people he created, how could he consign so many of them to an eternity of torture in hell just because they didn't believe the right things about him? Yes, a horrible thought indeed. But is hell really a torture chamber of burning flames, with the devil running around with a pitchfork taunting us like we see in the cartoons? J.P. Moreland, a professor of philosophy and ethics at the Talbot School of Theology in California, argues that in the Bible, hell is separation or banishment from God, but also from those who have come to know and love him. He says the essence of hell is relational. Christianity says people are the most valuable things in the entire creation. And if people matter, then personal relationships matter. And hell is largely relational. It's about being alone. The banishment is not into a literal life of eternal burning, but rather a life of isolation from God's presence and all his goodness. What is literal is that hell is a place of utter heartbreak. It's a loss of everything. Hell is the worst possible situation that could ever happen to a person. Perhaps the images and concepts of hell we have bought into are not as we imagine it. We talked about this in a couple of sermons last year, and I'm sure it will come up again in the future. And finally, number 3 in our list of reasons to study apologetics: to be able to give an answer when asked. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. The Interpreter's Bible commentary on this passage notes that it is not enough to cherish Christ in the heart. The believer is to be ready always to give a defense concerning the hope that we cherish or the faith that we embrace. Silent devotion is not enough. If we really do find our hope in Christ, we should want to share it with others, but always in gentleness and respect. This is not an opportunity for unintelligent ranting or arrogant language. Nor is it the time to use the biggest, most impressive sounding vocabulary we know. Conversations don't need to be about winners and losers. It's not a battle of who is wrong and who is right. Ravi Zacharias has a lovely quote to this effect. He says, "The goal in most conflicts is to destroy your opponent. The goal in apologetics is to win your opponent." I love that. It is the time to listen to others and understand where they're coming from and what they are saying. Questions posed to us about our faith provide an opportunity to get to know another human being and to share with them the hope we have found in Jesus. It may be a one-time conversation you have with a stranger, or a series of conversations you have with someone more regularly. And don't get me wrong, this sermon is not about directing you to get out there and evangelize your world. It is about empowering you to find answers to questions you have in your own head and to invite you to share what you learn with others when opportunities arise. We live in a hungry, hurting world, and we have the power to offer Jesus as the one who can heal and breathe life into the souls of those around us. Remember back to my comments about Charles Templeton, the evangelist turned agnostic. Lee Strobel interviewed Templeton in his book, The Case for Faith. And in the conversation, Templeton told Strobel that he very much admired Jesus. He said, "In my view, Jesus is the most important human being that has ever existed." And as his voice cracked, he said, "And I miss him. I miss him." And with that, tears flooded into his eyes, and he began to sob. Even although he had turned from Christianity, he missed Jesus. With all the questions still lingering in many people's heads, the biggest apologetic is a genuine experience with the living Christ. We are never invited to throw away reason and logic for faith. They are not mutually exclusive. They work together, and this is not what God ever asks of us. We are invited to test everything and keep what is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, "But test everything that is said, hold on to what is good." And our goodness flows out of an experience with God that changes us on the inside. This is a real and genuine experience which serves as the most powerful apologetic we can ever offer anyone. It's okay not to have the answers to everything. Not having an answer doesn't mean you're wrong. Not having an experience doesn't mean Jesus isn't real. But when one truly experiences Jesus, there is little need of convincing after that. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for sending Jesus to show us the way to you. Thank you for revealing who you are in the cosmos and the beauty of creation we see around us. Thank you for not giving up on us when we do not respond to your voice, calling us to you over and over again. There are so many reasons to believe in you. Help us to continue to search for you in all the answers offered. Bless us as we go our separate ways to enjoy the wonderful warm sunshine and celebrate the birthday of this magnificent country we live in. In your precious name, amen.